for being here with us today. The weather played a little bit of a spoilsport, but we're so happy that we're here and we're able to have this conversation with the both of you. As Malvika mentioned, this session is about revisiting a classic and sculpting a sequel. And I want to first begin by asking the both of you that did you know that there was going to be a sequel when you wrote the first novel? Like when you wrote The Boy in the Striped Pajamas and when you wrote Human Traces, did you know then that you would write a sequel later on?
Well, good evening, everybody. Yes, I did when I wrote Striped Pajamas in '04, and when I finished the first draft of it, I already knew that at some point in my life I would return to Gretel, who's Bruno's older sister in that book. But I knew that I would return to her as an old woman. I always thought I would wait. I actually always thought that I would wait. It might be the last book I would write in my life. Maybe it is the best I will write in my life. Who knows? But I wanted to explore her as a contemporary character. So if she'd been a real person and been alive, she'd be 91 last year, which was when I published the book. So um, I just kept notes for many years on my computer about who she might be, what might have happened to her. And then it was actually during COVID where I thought I won't wait until I'm much older. I'll write this now because then it could be at least she could still theoretically be alive. If I waited another 20, 30 years when she'd be 111, it wouldn't be possible. So
Sebastian, what about you? Did you know that you would write Snow Country after Human Traces?
Um, I didn't. Is this working?
Is this microphone?
I wrote Human Traces over about a 5 year period. It was a very long and difficult book and took me an awful lot of research. Um, and so the idea that I would write something else, it was absurd. It never occurred to me. But I'd written 3 books set in France, and I called them a trilogy, but they were not sequels of one another. They were just sort of loosely related. They were related by the fact that they were all set in France, and there were one character appeared in both, but in a very minor role. But I just like the idea of trilogies, really. It makes your stuff sound important somehow, doesn't it? Makes it sound weighty, not just some sort of little novella that's going to disappear tomorrow. So I then announced that Snow Country, when I wrote it, although it's not really a sequel, insofar as you don't pick up the story of the characters. I said this is the second book in a trilogy, and there was a slight amazement in some of the reviews. Why on earth has he gone back sort of to a book he wrote 15 years ago? Well, basically because I liked the book, and I did pick up one of the characters, but she had to be quite a bit older by then.
Right.
Um, and I think really it's just a question of if you're interested. I liked the characters. I suppose that's really what it was. And it's very hard to write characters who are nice. It's very difficult to make nice people interesting. And in my, when you look back at books you've written, normally you think how bad they are and how they ought to have been better. But when I look back at Human Traces, I think it should have been shorter for sure. But I did like the characters, so I just wanted to spend a bit more time them or their legacy.
I think sometimes that actually the word sequel, we should also use the word companion novels, because I don't really see All the Broken Places as sequel so much as a companion novel to Striped Pajamas. And, books like Birdsong, Charlotte Gray, Girl at the Leon Door, they're more companion novels, I think, to each other because they share I hate the word universe in that cinematic way, but they share a world, and they share characters, but they're all individual stories completely on their own and that can be read individually. And you don't have to have read the others to. I never think you should have to read another book in order to read one book. You should just be able to read the book itself.
Of course, you had that difficulty with the end of the boy with the striped pajamas. That the character, I don't think there's a problem with spoiler alerts at this at this distance, but the 2 characters you cared about most, sadly, were not able to return. But I started reading what we're not going to call the sequel, the companion book, and uh, I don't think it's a sequel, really. But I was very fascinated and touched by the sort of little echoes that you produced between the 2 books. And, life is full of these unexpected correlations and so on. And it's not really a question of continuing the same story. It's a question of seeing how all life is interconnected, really, in different worlds. And actually, in Snow Country, now I come to think of it, the main female character, Delphine, turns out to be the sister of the main female character in Birdsong. So there's a sort of connection there. But companion is even putting it a bit strongly. They're just sort of, like acquaintances who pass. And the more I write books, the more I think that all lives are in some strange way interchangeable. If I live long enough, I will write a rather religious book, I think, a rather mystical book, in which will all the characters will be indivisible fragments of the same great character. But I need to acquire much more wisdom and serenity before I write that.
But when you did decide to write these companion books, let's call them that and not sequels, did it ever occur to you that both of them were such deeply profound and, popular, so as to say? So, did it come to you if you could maintain that legacy with what you're writing? Did that occur to either of you?
Well, I mean, I've always known that, I'll never write a novel that sells as many copies as Striped Pajamas. You don't get that kind of book.
You don't know, John. Don't give up.
Well,
Billion copies, is it?
that's
And
yeah,
counting.
and yeah. But you don't look at it in those terms. It's more about sort of whether you can achieve artistically what you set out to achieve. And I think if you put too much pressure on yourself to recreate a moment like that, you're turning something that was a hugely positive experience in life into something that becomes negative. And I don't see the reason to do that. So I wouldn't have gone back to Striped Pajamas with All the Broken Places if I hadn't absolutely felt there was a story I wanted to tell there. I wasn't doing it to sort of try to sell 11 million copies of it. I knew that wouldn't possibly happen. But I wanted to go back and revisit Gretel and find out for myself as much as anything what happened to her in the years after the war and who she would be today.
Um, can I ask John a question? Sorry, I'm not trying to do you out of a job,
Please do.
but if you pitch a book towards a more grown-up audience, do you worry that you're excluding younger readers, or do you think that older readers loved The Boy in the Striped Pajamas anyway, and younger readers will be able to enjoy All the Broken Places just as much? Or am I being very simplistic in thinking of the age at which you
Can I
pitch it?
add something to that? Because this was one of my questions as well. So when you wrote the book, right, you wrote it for a YA audience, so as to say, but those people have now also grown up
Yeah.
who will read the book now. So do you think about these things about how it'll affect the audience or what kind of audience you're
I,
writing it?
I don't really that much. I am clear when I set out on something, am I writing an adult novel or am I writing a YA book? But I've always felt that the books I write theoretically for adults um, can be read by, teenagers. And I've always felt the books I write for young people could be read by adults. They just have a child at the center of them. So I don't really see a huge amount of difference between them. Um, but I did like the idea that I couldn't think of many sort of, if we were to use the word sequel, what was published originally as a children's book to have a follow-on novel which was published deliberately as an adult book, and I thought that was kind of interesting, and I did feel that like yes, the audience would have grown up, and it does make me feel very old sometimes because when people say to me and they bring their child along, they say I read this in school and they've got their own kid or something. I think what am I 100 or something? It's
It seems to me, I mean, I've never written for children or young adults, and I wouldn't know how to go about it. But um, one of the interesting things about your those two books is that in the one that's supposedly written for the younger of the two groups of readers, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, is actually quite a sort of literary book insofar as it's very what is really happening is very unsaid. It's very subtle. I mean, you rely on a certain knowledge in the reader, but also you feed in enough to a reader who doesn't know history. But it's really almost everything is happening off stage in a very sort of sophisticated way. And yet, with the book obviously written for grown-up readers, All the Broken Places, it's very narrative driven and it's very sort of in your face, really. And that struck me as being perhaps the reason they're both successful. But it's also on the face of it quite odd. Do you see what I mean?
I do. And I suppose it is, and it's maybe just how I've changed as a writer over the 20 years in between, but also with the narrative voice, I suppose, because I did always want Striped Pajamas to be that the reader would be one step ahead of the central character because you would know, with the benefit of history and knowledge, what Bruno does not know, which makes it scarier for the reader. Whereas with Gretel, she's 91 and she knows everything, you know. So yes, it's written, I guess, in a different sort of style.
I was going to ask you this also that, so much time has passed since the first to the second one, to the companion novel. So, your style of writing, you as a writer have also evolved. What you wrote so many years ago and how you write now, I'm sure that has also changed. So, how do you think that has made an impact on, say, the second companion novel?
Um, I suppose I don't really think I have a style that is mine. I think I have a style which it fits the book. So for any given book, I need to find a tone of voice, a narrative tone of voice that works for that, and they're each different. So I don't really see myself as sort of bottle of wine which is aging and tastes different every year as it sort of grows older and matures, and then starts to go a bit feeble and weak and then turns to vinegar. I just see myself as being able to write any kind of sentence that I want to do, but having to pick a rhythm and a form and a length of sentence and a range of vocabulary which seems to me best to suit that particular book. And I think with Human Traces, I wrote in very long sentences on the grounds that this book was set. It begins in about 1880. And I also made a decision that in dialogue, I wouldn't have people say wouldn't, I'd have them say would not. And I think in retrospect, that was a mistake. Because actually, if you read Victorian novels, if you read Dickens, people do say can't and won't and couldn't. But I just wanted it to be, I wanted it to seem old. And I wanted it to seem quite,
That time.
yeah, of the period and so on. But overall, I think I have simply, if there has been any overall change in my style, like the bottle of wine, it has simply been I really hardly ever use adverbs at all anymore. And I use fewer adjectives, but still, I view it as a completely flexible thing.
John, do you think you have changed in terms of how you write, and has it affected Broken Places?
I discovered that there are things that there are phrases that I would use a lot. I had to stop using them. There was always somebody who would pause for a moment and look away, you know, and just to slow down a sentence or something, I would have somebody pause for a moment and look away. And I did a search on it in some novel, I can't remember which one, in a draft of it, and there was like 15 of them or something. I thought, right, I gotta, cut that out, stop doing that. Um, but you were always kind of looking for ways in when you're writing, say, dialogue, when you're writing a scene between two characters, of slowing down the conversation. It's not because it's not a play. It's not back and forth. So you have to find kind of connecting sentences to make it to just fill it and make it feel real in a
Do
conversational way.
I find eating and drinking quite helpful for that.
Oh yeah, there's an awful lot of
He
sipping of
paused and
beers in
poured
my
a cup of
books.
tea, and
Yeah.
people used to light a lot of cigarettes in dialogue, but sadly you can't do that anymore. But he went over to the window and stared out at the traffic before turning back into the room. It's all rather. But
Yeah.
it took me a hell of a long time to realize what the purpose of dialogue in a book was, actually. With the first books I wrote, I used to think, why is dialogue so unrealistic? And all of these were unpublished and terrible books. But I would have people come in and say, so how was your journey here? It was fine, but there's a bit of a traffic jam around, the M25. Yeah, shit, the weather's been awful, isn't it? How are you? I'm fine. And I didn't really realize what dialogue was for until really quite late in the day. And really, as far as I'm concerned, and John may not agree, dialogue is a way of giving information to the reader, but in a different form, so that you're not being, they don't want a lot of exposition. There's a great character in the Austin Powers films called Basil Exposition, who comes in to explain the plot and all the spying that's going on. Basil, would you like to talk us through where we are now? And this is absolutely death in a narrative, but it's quite feasible for people to exchange views of other people or give bits of information that the reader needs to know. So now when I do dialogue, I always run my eye over the page and say, the character doesn't need to know this, but does the reader need to know everything that is exchanged between these two people? Otherwise, forget it.
But you also use long letters as a form of letting the readers, know information in both the novels, more so in Human Traces. So that's also a way for you to,
And I think that performs the same function, and it's a variation for the reader. It makes it easier for them. They're bored with exposition, third person narration. A letter. Well, everyone's heart lifts up a little bit when you get a letter, doesn't it? And also, it allows you to give the inner feelings of somebody direct and in their own language. Of course, you can go in if you're writing in the third person. You can go inside any character, and you can tell the scene from their point of view, and that lets the reader share it, but it's not in their own words. So it's a way of doing that. And sometimes also in a book, a character has to earn the right to have a scene narrated from with the
his
author,
point of
from the authorial point of view. And if your character hasn't quite earned that status in the book, then a letter is a good way of giving us a glimpse.
view. Right. John, you mentioned that revisiting old characters is risky yet exhilarating. So, can you tell us how it's risky and how you felt, exhilarated when you were doing it?
Well, you don't want to damage the legacy of a book that, has been very popular or very successful in some way by writing something that's some way destroys that or damages it. So you have to feel that you're writing a better book, even if you know it's not going to be as massive, say, but that you feel that it's a worthy um, it's a worthy companion to the original one. And in terms of the exhilaration of it, I found when I was writing All the Broken Places, I had spent so many years talking about the family in striped pajamas, almost every day of my life since I published it, that to go back and finally sort of put words into their mouths again and find out, because I don't know about you, Sebastian, but I don't plot my novels in advance. I just start with the idea and I see where it will take me. So with Gretel, I didn't know what her story was going to be. I just started writing and let it build in front of me. And I find that a really exciting experience, especially when I feel it's going well and that I'm in control of it. And even if I don't know where it's going, I know that I'll figure it out. I don't know. Do you plot in advance or?
I have a sort of vague. I have a master plan. I'm going from London to Calcutta and stopping at these six cities on the way. I know where it's headed, but what happens in between, I don't really know. And sometimes the very ending, it depends. But one thing, looking again at the boy in striped pajamas before coming here, obviously, there's a fantastic amount of material about the Holocaust in film, libraries, written, first-hand documents, books, and so on. Did did you find any particular source that gave you great inspiration or information that was valuable?
Well, I did in the certainly the Rudolf Huss book that he wrote when he was captured after the war. There was a lot of information in that, and I didn't want Bruno's father to be specifically based on him, but there was a lot in there that really helped me in it. But I think it was just all because I was in a school earlier today and I was talking about it and saying, I had been so interested in the subject since I was a teenager and had read so widely on it, but I never thought of it as research for a novel. I just thought of it as education. I was really interested in something and would keep returning to it time and again, so that when I came to the point where that novel formed in my mind, it was because of these decades before it of reading.
Sorry, I'm doing the interview. Do you mind?
Makes
And
my job easier.
and how when you came to talk about these terrible, terrible events, did you feel, and I've written about these terrible events, and not at such length, but briefly, did you feel, how dare I? What right have I?
No, no, I didn't, because I think every writer has the right to write any story that he or she wants to write. And if it's a historical story, or if it's something that's not from your own personal experience or culture, sure, we should inform ourselves as much as possible, have as much knowledge as we can on the subject, but then we have the right to write it. The line I always love is what James Joyce said about grammar: "If you know the rules of grammar, you can break them." And it's the same with anything to do with history, and even with such a sensitive topic as the Holocaust. That I felt if I knew as much as I could possibly know, then I have the I have the right to put it down in a story. Was it? I try to remember which book of yours was it. A Week in December, or which novel is it that there's a long section that's set in a concentration camp, um,
It's a possible life.
The Impossible Life, um, which is very brutal as it reaches the end of it. I mean, it's extreme and upsetting and traumatic. So I suppose I'd ask you the same question, or did you get any blowback from that? Or
Um, well, the first time I sort of went there, as it were, was in Charlotte Gray, and I felt that I was telling the world something that I hadn't really known about, which was the deportation of French Jews, French Jews as well as refugees in France by the French in collaboration with the Nazi occupier. And so I felt that actually by telling the world that yes, the French gendarmerie were complicit in the Holocaust by exporting their own citizens as well as refugees to the death camps, that I was performing a sort of journalistic function. And I think that was how I sort of reasoned with myself. Also, of course, in those days, the idea of writing other people's experience was not so sensitive as it has become. But I think that a big moment for me was when I was at this place in northern Paris called Drancy, which is a sad sort of suburb in the north, which was a holding camp for Jewish refugees and French Jews before they were deported. It was the whole French collaboration in the deportation was completely denied by the government and the state for at least 40 years. But eventually, reluctantly, it was discovered that this had happened, and it was proved by a Romanian French lawyer called Serge Klaasveld, who said 80,000 were deported. And the French state said nothing happened. No, we never did this. And he said, I will name them. And by using transport lists from the French railways and from Poland and Germany, he named, I think, 74,000 of the 80,000. So there was no going back after that. And eventually they put in this housing estate, which was the holding camp, they put a truck, one of those horse trucks that were used. And I was there one day and looking at it. I'd been there before, and there was a woman standing there who was not one of the residents of this block, clearly looking at this horse truck. And she said to me in French, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm an English novelist and I'm writing about what took place here a long, long time ago." And she said, "Yes, indeed." And I said, "What are you doing here? You don't live here." She said, "No, no, I don't. But I was in that truck or one very like it." And she pulled up her sleeve and she showed me the tattoo, and she had been deported from there as a quite young child. And I felt that I then said to her, "Will you describe to me what it was like?" Of course, I sort of knew what it was like because I'd read in museums and documents and archives, but I somehow felt that having met someone and sort of shaken hands with her on the site gave me a sort of not quite authority, but it was almost like a sort of permission in a way. So that was, but that was a matter of pure good fortune, I have to say. And I worked as a long time as a journalist, and sometimes good luck is terribly important.
Just staying with this for a little longer, John, when the success of striped pajamas, do you think it was someplace a casualty of its own success in terms that when you were writing the second one, did it come to your mind that you had to, justify something or prove something through the stand that you're taking in the book? Did these things come to your mind because there had been, so many people had read it, so many people had opinions, there was a movie theater and all of that. So did you think there was something that you had to justify because of the topic that you were talking about?
no, no, I didn't think I had to justify anything. It had certainly gone through its as oftentimes happens with some books, goes through its period of being beloved and then being loathed and then being loved and then loathed, and it seems to go through some weird sort of cycle. But I didn't write it to justify anything or to bash down any critics or anything like that. I wrote it because I felt it was the right time in my life that this was the story I wanted to tell next. And I kind of trust my instinct on that every time with every book I write, that the whatever is sort of jumping up and down in my head and says, this is what your next book should be. I trust that.
Whatever ups and downs it goes through, it will always be read with pleasure because of the main character. And you have got a 9-year-old boy. He's 9, dear. I mean, it just so perfectly that desire to be an explorer and that tremendous engagement and enthusiasm with the world, coupled with a sort of complete ignorance of what is really going on. I mean, when I read it when it first came out, I mean, it was like being 9 again to me. Um, so whatever else, whatever other politics or fashion may say, it will always it will always be read with pleasure for that reason, I think. Um, but can I ask another question
Yes.
there? Um, there's a film that's recently come out in Britain, which will, I hope, come out here too, called The Zone of Interest, which is a very, very good film based on a not terribly good novel, actually, I must say, by an English writer, Martin Amis, um, which covers very much very similar territory.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it yet, and I'm waiting to see it because I never actually read the novel. I've read most of Martin Amis's books, but I never read that one. I didn't read some of the later ones. Um, but I am looking forward to seeing the film because what everything I've heard about it, it sort of sounds quite similar.
It's right up your street. I mean, it's not in any way a plagiarism,
Yeah.
but it has the same technique of it. It follows the life of the commandant of Auschwitz, the family life, and it's a bourgeois German family who are completely obsessed with growing things in the garden and schooling their children and visits from the auntie and the father's promotion. And what is happening on the other side of the wall is just never mentioned. And when the commandant is promoted and moved on to a bigger and better job, the wife is furious. We've made our home here. The children are in such good schools. I mean, I'm making it sound funny, and in a way, it sort of is comic in the sort of deepest shade of black. But and there is no scene at all on the wrong side of the fence, as it were, apart from one quite close up of the man's face. He's obviously watching some arrivals on the ramp, but you don't see any of the poor people arriving in trains at all. And it's very, very, very chilling in very much the way that your book is.
Uh,
Normally recommend if you don't mind being horrified.
Sebastian, what you asked John about, what text he read to get information or as research. So you've been a journalist, and I'm sure that involves a lot of research. So what was your research like for human traces? Because it talks about, doctors and real doctors and what their theories were around mental health at that time. So but the characters that you have spoken about, Thomas and Jack. They are fictional characters. So, how did that balance happen? And what was the sort of research that you had to do to write Human Traces?
Well, my research into writing human traces was to try to discover how the human mind works and why it breaks down and goes wrong. So, not much. 5 years, biology, genetics, and I went to a lot of psychiatric hospitals. I talked to a lot of psychiatric doctors, psychiatrists, and to some patients, including one incredibly illuminating woman who was a very serious schizophrenic, but in remission from her illness, had great insights into her own condition. Um, so, it was enormous, and I read a lot of Freud. And I mean, I think to me, it was just a titanic amount of research. I had two people working for me at one time, but the trouble with having people doing research for you is they don't really know what they're looking for. So it was actually pretty hopeless. So just reading until my eyes sort of bled, really, thinking about it. But as far as trying to organize it into a book was concerned, the breakthrough for me was ascribing one school of thought to one of the doctors, which is basically that mental illness is largely hereditary and has a biological basis. and to the other doctor, the school of thought that mental illness is largely a response to the circumstances of your life, and we'll all be prone to it. You don't have any genetic predisposition. This is a debate which became lively at the end of the 19th century and which is still going on. And actually, it has changed since I wrote Human Traces. When in about 20 years ago, I think you would have said the biological medical model was winning, and I think you would now say it's pretty much lost. And the psychological model has prevailed to the extent that in America they are about to abandon pretty much all disease categorization in mental illness because not, it's all driven by drug companies and corruption, and people just manufacture the symptoms to fit the pills they're trying to sell. And I think eventually we will come to a stage of understanding that uh, mental illness is a spectrum, and on which we all are. And I'm on the scale of 1 to 100. I'm about a 5, and but there are some poor people who are about 100. But actually, trying to pin labels on them is now increasingly being given up, as we just can't do it. We can't manage it.
It's clear with the way you talk about it that there's like a deep connection that you have with this subject, and so does John when he talks about that he read a lot about it. But can you pinpoint or talk about how this connection came to be? Like these are very deep and profound themes. How do you think you got this interest in the Holocaust, where you started reading a lot, and the book came about later? And Sebastian, for you, this whole thing about how the mind works. Do you remember how this interest began in the first place?
Well, I really started around age 15, and I think the thing that struck me the most once I started reading books and reading nonfiction about the Holocaust was about the fact that that Ireland was a neutral country during the Second World War, and I think that's kind of a shameful part of our history, to be honest. And it was because, of course, the Catholic Church was so dominant during those years, and they made sure to keep as many Jewish people out of Ireland as possible. But of course, had the Nazis won the war and invaded Britain, well, what's the next country across? It's Ireland. So we wouldn't even give the ports to Churchill to use the ports for the ships or battleships, whatever they had. Um, it's sort of letting other people fight for you and fight the moral case as well, and then sort of sitting back and taking the freedom offered by it. So I felt I've always had a real problem with that with Irish history in terms of what we did, or rather what we didn't do in the Second World War, and that the so-called decency of the Catholic Church in Ireland was because it was they call it what Pius the Ninth or something, but Hitler's Pope. I think John Cornwell was it wrote a book, non-fiction book about him, and was making sure that Ireland was um, remaining as this Catholic bastion of that it had always been and isn't so much now, thankfully. But I think that was like that was a thing that sort of triggered me even like as a teen, wondering how do you get I never quite understood how you get away with just being neutral. Like I never quite understood how Switzerland can just be neutral. Like why didn't they just get invaded? I don't like you can't just say, well, we're neutral. But certainly Ireland would have been invaded next, and we weren't because the war was won. So I think that's kind of a thing for me.
Um, I suppose when I was growing up and first started to read proper literary books, and then at school studying English, and then at university I read English, it was always thought to be what a great novel should tell you a lot about human nature. So when I came to try to write novels, I wanted to tell people a lot about human nature. So I thought pretended I was a chemist really. And if you had a new substance, what you do is you go into the laboratory and you see at what temperature it freezes and what temperature it boils. What can you do with it? What does it mix with? So I think a lot of my books, especially the early ones, are putting human beings in very, very extreme situations of war, usually, or passionate love, and seeing, whether what point they boil, at what point they freeze, when they break. I mean, to me, writing Birdsong, the big question was what at what point would in the First World War would the commanders have said, "We have now killed enough people"? They killed 10 million in Europe, um, but uh, would they have gone on to 20, 25, 30 at what to the last man standing? And that was a question that's never really answered. The book was initially called "How Far Can You Go?" actually, and then I realized that that was the title of a comic novel by David Lodge. Um, and then I think likewise my interest in mental health and madness and the instability of the human mind. I mean, I think in these extreme states, you get insight into what we are and our fragility, particularly. Most old people go mad in some sense. I'm putting that in a very non-medical way, and 1 in 100 of us throughout the world, any country, will be psychotic, will have delusions, will hear voices from people who are not there. And this was pretty interesting to me. And also, when I was growing up little boy, I just happened by chance, by misfortune, to know a lot of people who did develop very serious. I think we've been cut off. I happened by chance. No, is that better? No, no, it's gone. I happened by chance. I think it was a loose connection back there. But to know a lot of children and young people who did develop very serious illnesses, most of whom took their own lives. Um, and I just remember when I was about 14, that feeling that these people were not being understood at all. Everyone rather recoiled from them. I remember my godmother's son coming to lunch. He was 21, and we were told he was suffering from paranoid delusions of grandeur. And the question that everybody asked was, is it real or is it all in the mind? And even as a little boy, I could realize that was a completely false question. The opposite of is it real is it not real? And is it the opposite of is it all in the mind? Is it all in the body? And then you realize that mind is a function of brain and the brain is in the body. So I mean I just wanted to answer that question, which I wasn't able to answer when I was 13. So I didn't get around to it till I was about 50. But I did answer it. And the answer is yes, it is real. It's as real as anything can be. And it's all in the body.
I would also want some audience questions, but the last question from me before that. Do external perspectives and what the world, the audience is saying ever affect what you write? Like in the age of social media, it's so easy for people to make a comment, write a review immediately. So, does that affect how you write or how you plan what you want to do next? Does that affect your books at all?
It certainly doesn't affect how I write or what I write, and I've really, really tried to not look at that sort of stuff anymore. There was certainly a point in my life where I did, and it would kind of get on top of me. But I don't know. I think if a few years down the line, it just seems why bother? It's just because you'll read 100 nice comments, and it's the one nasty comment that stays with you, and just drives you up the wall. So I try not to really read that stuff anymore.
But you do get a very funny book out of
I did, yeah.
it.
I got the echo chamber out of it, but
Yeah, you got it out of your system. That's the best way.
yeah.
Write it out, have fun with it. It's the best way of. I don't really follow social media at all. I mean, I am on Twitter, but I only tweet facetious remarks about cricket. So it isn't something that's really affected me. Reviews. I get a sense and I read them eventually, but I try not to read them when I'm going along because you have to do so much publicity, and if you're going to get up on a stage and try to be confident and to pretend to the world that you've written a really interesting book. In the back of your mind, there's a spiteful little bastard who's, being part of a drive-by shooting as a part of some ridiculous revenge for some imagined slight you cut his girlfriend at a party or something. You just can't be doing with that. It's just too difficult. So I read them all in the end, and then I'm amazed by how intelligent and lucid and worthwhile most of them are. And I just take a very Mary Poppins Pollyanna view of life.
Uh, do we have
Try to,
any
anyway.
questions in the audience for John or Sebastian? Yes.
Okay, so the question was, as part of the research for Striped Pajamas and All the Broken Places, did I get a chance to interact with actual Holocaust survivors? I did, certainly, not in the run up to writing Striped Pajamas, but in all the years in between, and then obviously between the years up to All the Broken Places. Because when I was touring for so long with Striped Pajamas, I met quite a lot of survivors actually along the way, especially in America. Because in those years, I remember they would bring me, the publishers would bring me to a lot of Jewish community centers, and I did a lot of events in Holocaust memorial buildings around the world and so on. So I met a lot of people at that and got to hear their stories. And just like Sebastian saying about that lady in France who showed him the tattoo, it's one of those things that I look back at and I realize kind of we're part of the last generation of writers who has that opportunity, you know, because obviously time is moving on. And for me, it's one of the like really great experiences I had in my life was getting to meet them and hear stories firsthand.
Yes, it's a privilege, really.
Um, did I consciously do anything to? No, I mean, I really just tried to remember what it was like to be nine, you know, in the first book, and so much of Bruno's personality is based on who I was at nine. The books he read, Treasure Island is the book that he carries with him. It was his favorite book. It was my favorite book as a kid. The way he overhears adult phrases and reuses them and gets them wrong sometimes is something that my I remember my brother called me a juvenile delinquent when I was about seven or something, and I went around calling everybody a juvenile delinquent, and I used the same technique with Bruno, you know, for the hopeless case for Gretel, the out of bounds at all times, and no exceptions for father's office and so on. So I really wanted to use kind of the kind of language a 9-year old would use, even though it's not a first person narrative. It is effectively because it's all through his eyes. And for the second one, because it's so much more mature in its way, because it's such an elderly woman, it was a very different technique entirely. So, I mean, maybe if I had if met those people before I wrote Striped Pajamas, it would have been different in that way. But um, I'm kind of pleased enough with the way it was.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, Bachi. Sebastian, I think you should take
If
this
the
one.
question was if you have a vast amount of material, background research, and so on, how do you decide what goes into the book and what doesn't? Um, That's a very good question, and I think I've been guilty of putting too much in. Sometimes, if you get very excited by something, you want to share your understanding of it, and you don't need to share it all, really. You need to get excited about that on the quiet and tell your wife or friends that in the pub. While I was writing Human Traces, I would write long essays on parts of Freud and parts of hypnotism and how asylums worked, but I never intended them to be in the book. I would just send them to my agent. I just wanted to get it clear in my mind, and I can only get things clear in my mind if I write them down. So I would send them to him, and he'd plow through them and say, "Fine, fine, yeah, very interesting. Now, have you done the Times crossword today yet?" So that was one way of keeping it out. But the simple and obvious answer is that it has to be relevant to the narrative, really. And my books don't have a necessarily a very strong narrative drive, except in my own mind, there is a progress going on. And anything that isn't relevant to that, fascinating though I may find it, if it's not relevant to the character or to that propulsion of the story, then reluctantly it has to go. But it's never lost, it's never wasted, because it's always in the back of your mind or it's always in a notebook. And the longer you write, the more you can retrieve things which would have slowed down the story there, but actually have a bearing on this. And in an altered form, you can use them elsewhere.
And also, you can't write that finished book without having written all the stuff you cut as well. It all becomes part of the process that builds that final published novel.
Okay, we have another question.
No, that's been a fascinating discussion, and there's so many questions I have. But one for John Boyne, as a fellow Dubliner, and maybe 20 years older than yourself, as a history teacher I was, I really agree with what you say about Irish neutrality and the eminence of the Catholic Church. Is there, you talk about some, what I did use the phrase, you think something around in your head inspiring your next novel or your, can you speak a bit more about that and what your childhood actually and your schooling might contribute to that, like learning history, for instance? This is about the ideas kind of jumping up and down in the head and what my childhood or schooling might have contributed to it. I don't think my schooling contributed to it very much because I didn't have a very positive experience in my school in Dublin. I had a pretty negative one, to be honest, and I certainly wasn't encouraged as a writer there, or any kind of creativity was not encouraged. And because I write books, some books for young people, I go into schools a lot now, and I see it so different because teachers today seem to be much more enthusiastic about getting kids being creative and encouraging that aspect of themselves, which I think is terrific. But in terms of the ideas, I find that because I read a lot and I write a lot, that I'm fortunate enough that I seem to get a lot of ideas, and most of those ideas won't go anywhere, but I'll make a note of them and see. And I just seem to find that when I'm getting to the end of a project, when I'm getting close to the end of the final draft of a novel, or the edits and all that, I just find that something is, without me searching for it, is just calling on me in a way, and it's sort of saying, "This is the one that you should do next." And I just trust my instinct really on it, and uh, I always have. I mean, like when I finish what I'm doing now, I already pretty much know what I'm going to aim for next, and I sort of feel good about that because it means I'm not sort of searching for something. It means I'm sort of enthusiastic about starting something. And then the more enthusiastic you are in the writing of the book, hopefully the better it's going to be for the reader when they read it.
I hear something strongly calling inside me, and it says dinner.
With that, we'll call it a night. Can we have a warm round of applause for John and
Thank you very
Sebastian?
much.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining us here at the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet. Thank you to all of you for staying back and listening to this conversation. Good night.